snap. The kick is in the air, and the kick this time is no, sir-ree. No, sir-ree. Final score, Tennessee 20, Florida 17. Pandemonium reigns.
You're listening to the RTI Podcast, powered by RockyTopInsider.com.
Hello, everyone, and welcome in to another episode of the RTI Podcast. I am Nathaniel Rutherford, the managing editor of RockyTopInsider.com, and I am joined, as always, by our staff writer here at RTI, Ben McKee. He is the Vols and baseball team beat reporter for us at RTI. He also helps out a lot with basketball and football as well for us. He's also the co-host and producer for the Swain Event morning radio show from every single morning on Monday through Friday from 7 to 10 a.m. You can listen to that on the Swain Event app and on Swain Event TV on Periscope, Facebook Live, and YouTube. If this is your first time listening to the RTI Podcast, we appreciate it very much. You can find us in a number of ways. A lot of you, I think, actually maybe a large number of you, but more than the traditional means, actually listen to it / interact with it on YouTube. So just if it's your first time listening, if you want to find us on YouTube and kind of watch the podcast that way and leave comments there, we're just Rocky Top Insider on YouTube. Subscribe to us there and turn on notifications so you see when our videos come out. And of course, we're also on Apple Podcasts. If you have an Android device, you can find us there as well. And at RockyTopInsider.com, you can click on the podcast tab and listen to it straight from that webpage or download it from there as well. Ben, there's not a whole lot to talk about off-season-wise for Tennessee football just yet. We will be starting to have, I think, later on this upcoming week, I'm thinking Monday, we'll probably start doing our first of the position previews for Tennessee in spring practices. So we'll have a little bit more stuff to kind of talk about spring practice-wise here soon, because that does start on March 9th. Before we get into all that, though, kind of the little bit of window we have here still with off-season before it gets into the spring practices, I want to talk a little bit about something that you and Swain brought up on the Swain event on Friday morning. And if I can't remember where you said the report came from, so you feel free to source it correctly, because I don't want to I want to give the right person the right credit. But whoever it was, whether it was VolQuest or an interview that Fulmer did, I don't remember which one it was now. You all said it came from, but there's talk now that there's been discussion, I think, this offseason by fans and media that should Pruitt get a not just a raise, but an extension. And it seems like the indications, reports, or whatever are pointing that to, yes, he is not just going to get a raise, but he's also going to get an extension. Obviously, no word on kind of how big that raise and extension is going to be. Before I share my thoughts, I want to get yours, Ben. How do you feel about the prospect of Pruitt getting a raise and extension off of this year, where it started off disastrously, but then they closed about as strong as you could ask them to close? They won 6 straight games, won 7 of their last 8, with their only loss coming to Alabama. They beat really all the teams they haven't been able to beat that aren't elite teams. They beat Missouri, they beat South Carolina, they beat Vanderbilt, teams they've been struggling to beat the last 3-4 years or so. And Tennessee did it, and they got to a bowl game, and obviously, bowl game didn't start how you wanted it to, but Tennessee did end up coming back and beating Indiana for that one to finish the season 8-5. You signed a top 10 recruiting class. So I'm curious your thoughts. How do you feel about the prospect of of Jeremy Pruitt getting a raise and extension potentially this offseason?
I think he's deserving of both because of today's day and age of college football, because of recruiting purposes. If a head coach has a smidge of success, then they are rewarded with an extra year added to their contract, or X amount of money added onto their contract as well. So for recruiting purposes, I definitely think it needs to happen, just because, believe it or not, that would be used against Tennessee in recruiting. It wouldn't necessarily impact Pruitt as much because he's not on the final year of his deal like Gus Malzahn was dealing with recently, but it would still be a thing. And on top of him deserving it in today's day and age of recruiting, he's also just flat out earned it. I know the season started out disastrous against Georgia State and BYU and games against Florida and Georgia, but he earned his money and more this season in the way he was able to turn the team around from 1-4 and get them to 8-5 with a crucial bowl win. And then with what he's been able to do on the recruiting trail, the arrow next to Tennessee's name, to Tennessee's program, is pointed upwards. The trajectory of the program is on an upward swing, an upward tick, however you want to label it, and that's because of the job that Pruitt has done this season, and obviously the rest of his coaching staff and the players, but you have to give a lot of credit to Pruitt for turning things around. So does he deserve a contract raise and extension? Yes, he does. But it shouldn't be just a ridiculous raise and extension. I would give him an added year onto his contract, and I would definitely give him more money. I don't really know how much money I would give him, but he definitely deserves to be banking more money than what Lane Kiffin is doing at Ole Miss, because Jeremy Pruitt has done more at Tennessee than Lane Kiffin has done as a college coach, in my opinion. So I definitely think Pruitt deserves a contract extension and raise.
Yeah, you mentioned Lane Kiffin there, and I was actually going to bring up some of the other new hires this offseason into the SEC who are coming in, and at Arkansas, Ole Miss. Actually, I need to look up Mike Leach's contract too. But Arkansas, Ole Miss, Mississippi State, and Missouri all have brought in new coaches this offseason. And I actually didn't know the contract details of all these guys until just now, looking up all this different stuff. I was shocked to find out that Eli Drinkowitz at Missouri is set to make around $4 million, which is right now, according to the USA Today coaches salary database of what coaches made this past year. Jeremy Pruitt made under $4 million. He's around 3.8. Obviously, had a chance to earn more with bonuses and whatnot, but he made just his base salary, just kind of the main thing, about $3.8 million. So Eli Drinkowitz comes in, who he has 1 year of head coaching experience before he's come to Missouri, and was one season at Appalachian State where, that program was already rolling, and I don't really know how much he really did there to help them to a 12-1 record this past season as their head coach. Obviously he was there. He should get credit for that, but like I said, that wasn't like a big rebuild. It wasn't. I don't know how much you really credit him with their success. Other than that, he's never been a head coach before, yet he's making more right now than what Pruitt's making. You mentioned like Kiffin. He is set to earn around $4 million a year at Ole Miss right now. I think look at the contract details. His first year will be 3.9, and that total will increase by $100,000 every year until his contract ends through 2023. At that point, he'll make $4.2 million per year. So, essentially $4 million or so around there for him. For Mike Leach, which he's a little different because obviously he's been a head coach for a while, but he also, has never coached in the SEC, but he's been head coach at Texas Tech and Washington State, and I feel like somewhere else he might have been a head coach at, but he's been a head coach for a long time. He is set to make, I think, around $4-ish million or so. This is the new contract also pays him more per year than he's making at Washington State. In December, he had signed a 5-year, $20 million extension with Washington State, so that's actually what he made there, and now it looks like he's going to make about $5 million at Mississippi State. So that one I can understand a little bit more because he's a guy who's coached for a long time. But I'm with you. I think in just this day and age of recruiting, not that Pruitt, like we said, he's not on the last year of his contract. He's not even on the last, I don't think he's in the last 2 years of his contract even. I think he signed a 5-year deal when he first came to Tennessee. But he was obviously not a head coach when he first got here, so you could get him a little cheaper. You gave him more money to throw at assistants, and he's done that. You look at what Jim Chaney and what Derek Ansley are making as coordinators. Chaney is coming away with the king's ransom of $1.5 million, which is only going to, I think, go up this upcoming season. Derek Ansley, who'd never been a DC at this level, he's making $1 million, a nice, cool $1 million. You had previously guys like Kevin Scher making $800,000. Chris Rump was making $700,000. Wolfren's still making $800,000 right now. And you're not having to pay T. Martin as much as he's worth because he's still getting buyout money from USC. So you have some money to play with because you lost some of your biggest contracts of non-coordinators this offseason who've gone to go to other schools or into the NFL. So I think, and Tracy Rocker is making something like close to $600,000, I think, or maybe just over $500,000. But you have money to give, and you brought in some guys who weren't commanding a ton of money, except for Jay Graham. He got a little bit of a pay raise than what David Johnson was making and for what he was making at Texas A&M. But Niedermeyer is not going to command the type of money those other guys were commanding. Brumbaugh, you're going to pay, I think, a good chunk of change for, but it's still not going to be what you were paying some of these other guys. And then obviously Shelton Felton, he's not going to be making. He's going to be the lowest paid head coach or lowest paid assistant coach, I think, him or Joe Osavet, but one of those two. Probably Osavet, since it's his first on-field coaching job. I think he's making, if I remember the reports correctly of his contract details, around 175,000, I think, somewhere around there per year. So you got him pretty cheap too. You have money to play around with, and I think it will look better for Tennessee and their, I guess, confidence in Jeremy Pruitt if they give him not a huge bump, but if you bump him up over that $4 million mark, if you give him 4.1, 4.2, that's a $400,000 raise. If you want to go to even flat $500,000 raise and give him to 4.3, that's fine. Or maybe you push it up a little bit to 4.4, that's fine. But I think you got to get him there because it doesn't make sense, as you said, to have Lane Kiffin, who, yes, he's been a head coach for a while, but he's not exactly been a successful Power 5 head coach. He had a good run at FAU, but you look what he did at Tennessee. He was there for 1 year, and it was fine, but then he bolted for USC, where, yes, they had the sanctions and all that stuff going on, but obviously did not have the amount of success that people were hoping he would have. He wasn't successful in the NFL. I just don't understand getting Kiffin, for a little around or right above $4 million, making more than Pruitt when Pruitt has proven himself, at least this year, and has been in the SEC the last 2 seasons and has a better record than what Kiffin has as a head coach at Tennessee, or at least perceived better as well. But yeah, I think that you have to give him, and if he's like making more than Eli Drinkowitz, that's insane to me. But like I said, I think 1 more year was fine, and I think bumping him up to around that 4.2, 4.4-ish million range, I think that's reasonable. You look at what other coaches are making that this year. Paul Chryst of Wisconsin was making $4.1 million. Matt Rule at Baylor was making $4.1 million. Will Muschamp at South Carolina, who is essentially a lame duck right now, he made $4.4 million. He's been there longer, and I don't know that you could probably justify paying Pruitt more than Muschamp, but I think that's right around where he deserves to be, is kind of that Will Muschamp range, because he hasn't won a championship or anything like that. He hasn't competed for an SEC East title just yet. Muschamp's likely on his way out, but I think that's the kind of range you're looking at where, heck, Chad Morris was making more money at Arkansas this past year than what Jeremy Pruitt was making at Tennessee. So I think it's smart to give him more money, because you saved a lot of money with some of the coaching changes you made this offseason, but I don't think you did it to get cheaper. I think Pruitt made some good hires and made some good younger hires, as we've talked about in the last podcast, where I like the construction of this staff more than I did in year 3 of Pruitt's staff, more than I did of year 2 of Pruitt's staff.
Yeah, for sure. And you also have to show Jeremy Pruitt that you appreciate him for down the road, because what if there is a day that comes to where Alabama comes calling, or another big-time program comes calling, and hopefully at that point Jeremy Pruitt realizes what he has built at Tennessee and wants to stick around. But what if he ends up in a Dabo Swinney type situation at Tennessee, Alabama comes calling, and he thinks back to, well, Tennessee always had my back to begin with and has always taken care of me. So if you have a good football coach, you have to take care of them. It's really as simple as that. And not even football. You just have to take care of your coaches in general and do whatever is necessary to keep them happy, as long as they are producing on the field. And at the current moment, no, Jeremy Pruitt hasn't won an SEC championship or played for one. But based off where the program has been, he is winning, in my opinion. His rebuild is further along than I anticipated. I thought it'd be year 4 or year 5 before Tennessee started competing for championships, and here we are in year 3 talking about, if Tennessee finds good quarterback play, they have a legitimate chance to make it to Atlanta. So if you have a good coach, you just simply have to take care of them. You saw this with basketball and Rick Barnes. Yes, he was, a certain dollar amount away from leaving to go to UCLA, but you also have to give kudos to Tennessee for ponying up and paying Rick Barnes what he deserves. So right now we're not talking about Jeremy Pruitt becoming one of the top 5 paid coaches in football or even the SEC, but he deserves to be making more money than what he is making now. So Tennessee needs to make sure that it gets taken care of, and I imagine that they will. They've always been willing to give out raises and extensions as long as they are producing. And right now, based off where the program was and based off his standard and expectations for last season, he is exceeding those. And I think Jeremy Pruitt will continue to exceed expectations and the standard that he has set so far.
Yeah, last year in the 2019 season, his salary ranked 32nd among all of the 130-ish Division I programs. So I know obviously not all schools disclose their salary. Schools like Air Force, BYU, whatnot, they don't disclose it. Rice, Temple, so things like that, they didn't disclose their information. But still, 32nd. That will pushing it up to what I suggested of the 4.234 area would put him right there at or right inside the top 25, which I think makes sense. I think that if you're hoping for top 25 results, you got to pay your coach like top 25 money. So I think that makes sense of pushing him into the top 25 range of salary per year. Like we said, we're not like you said, we're not saying that he needs to be paid top 10, top 5 money, even in top 5 money in the SEC. He just deserves more than what some of these other guys like Eli Drinkowitz, Lane Kiffin, Sam Pittman's on making $3 million, but those guys are making who haven't had success in the SEC necessarily, so at least not as head coaches. So I think it's coming. It's a matter of when it'll happen, and I'll be curious to see what the reaction will be from Vol fans and maybe some of the outside media. I know a lot of people probably don't care what the outside media, national media, has to say about Tennessee football anymore, but I still think it will be interesting to see what that reaction will be like. Ben, you mentioned Rick Barnes, and that kind of brings me into our second topic here I wanted to discuss on the podcast. And Tennessee is going to take on Auburn, number 13 Auburn, on Saturday. I don't want to talk a whole lot about that game because, at that point, this podcast is coming out Friday afternoon. That will age this podcast pretty poorly, and people will only listen to half the podcast. So for the second half, I don't want to talk specifically about this weekend's game, though it is very big, and we have a lot of coverage for you on RockyTopInsider.com about the game this weekend. But Ben, looking at this season, Tennessee 15-11, 7-6 in SEC play. I think coming into the year, I didn't have super high expectations. I think we actually had our contributor, Robert Hughes, do the season prediction piece with me. It wasn't you, so I don't actually remember if I asked you what your record prediction was before the year. But I know going into the season, I predicted Tennessee, and this was before all the stuff happened to them. I thought they'd be right around the 18-13 range. They can actually still get there. They're going to have some good luck and close out the season at least 3-2 to do that, and I don't know if they can do that. But that was back when Tennessee still had Lamonte Turner. That was back before we knew about Uros Plavsic, if he's going to be able to play. That was back before we knew Jordan Madden was going to be mired in one of his worst shooting slumps of his entire career. But right now, Tennessee 15-11, they're, I guess, kind of on the bubble. I don't really think they are. They're going to have to get a win like against Auburn or a win against Florida, Kentucky, and Arkansas. They're going to have to get 3 to 4 wins here in their final 5 games to get really solidly on the bubble. Losing to both Texas A&M and South Carolina really hurt their chances there. Ben, I'm curious what you think about this season, and kind of where would you say there's more fault to put here? Where would you put more of the blame? Because I see, we've talked about it. I don't think we've really talked about it on the podcast, but I know you and I have kind of talked about it off record, off camera, whatever, and you and Swain have talked about it on the show too. There's been not a lot, but there's been a decent amount of people on Twitter, online, after games, bringing up the $5 million contract about Rick Barnes and the $5 million coach shouldn't be doing this and all this different stuff, and really just going in on Barnes. And I think he deserves some blame and some credit for, or I guess not credit, but whatever, I guess blame just for this season and kind of how it's gone and as the roster construction. But at the same time, I think it's just this season has a lot more to do with the roster and just that it was naturally going to be a retooling, rebuilding year anyway. But then you throw in the fact that you lost 4 guys who played 80, 90, 100 games together. That kind of chemistry is almost unheard of now in college basketball. You lost 4 of those guys to the NBA. You lose a guy to transfer in DJ Burns, who you're expecting to be a contributor, who it wasn't because he had some kind of, it wasn't Rick Barnes' fault he left. That was DJ Burns' fault that he left. Derek Walker, that one, I don't think really hurts you a whole lot, but he ends up transferring. Zach Kent doesn't work out. And then you have Lamonte Turner go down after 11 games, kind of the end of December, he goes down for the rest of the year, decides to have the season-ending surgery. You bring in a freshman point guard who's having to play like 32, 33, 34 minutes a game for you at this point, and that's not ideal, but he's handling that very well. Then you get Plauschik cleared after the midway point of the season. Your Tennessee's roster in mid-January looked drastically different than what the roster looked like at the beginning of the year, and that includes, I mean, you lost one guy. You have Bowden in a horrible slump because he's not ready to be that main scoring guy. You have Vescovi as a true freshman being your point guard. You have Plauschik kind of as a bench role player, and then you lose Josiah Jordan-James to a re-aggravated injury. He's not been really 100% all season, and then he re-aggravates that hip growing injury, and he misses a good 2 weeks of basketball for Tennessee. So I think, to me, and I'll kind of rebuttal after your comments too, but I think, to me, there's a blame to go around for both parties here, both Barnes and the roster. But I think this year, kind of it being a little bit disappointing and things not going the way that they could have or should have, I look at it more as the roster and just the plain dumb luck Tennessee's faced. Because I think if you have Lamonte Turner, I think he's worth at least enough points to give you those Texas A&M and South Carolina wins, and that would put Tennessee at minimum right now at 17-9 and in a lot better situation. But if you have him, I mean, who knows how that Kansas game goes, because Tennessee was giving Kansas a fit. Who knows how the Kentucky game goes in Knoxville, because Tennessee was playing close with them for a while. Who knows how, I mean, there's a bunch of different games you can point to and say, if you had Turner back here as an experienced guard, as your main point guard, Vescovi coming off the bench, or letting Turner play more of that two-guard role sometimes too, how differently this season could go. So I don't, I know you can put some blame on Barnes for the roster being in the shape it's in right now, but at the same time, a lot of that I wouldn't put on him, and I really just think most of this season's issues have been the roster itself and just the bad luck and the bad breaks and just the weirdness of the roster this season that Tennessee's had to deal with.
Yeah, Rick Barnes doesn't deserve any blame for how this season has gone. It's not his fault that Lamonte Turner just had a horrific shoulder injury that he just could not fight through anymore. And if Lamonte Turner can't continue to fight through something, then it must really be bothering him. Mm-hmm. It's not Rick Barnes' fault that Jordan Bowden has had the worst shooting year of his career. Jordan Bowden has had plenty of open looks, courtesy of Rick Barnes' offense, and they're not falling. I mean, it's really as simple as that. And then Josiah Jordan-James has been hurt all year long. That's not Rick Barnes' fault either. So, and you mentioned the roster attrition. DJ Burns is at Winthrop and not at Tennessee because of DJ Burns. Nothing that Rick Barnes did. Zach Kent, I mean, he wasn't going to contribute this season, so I guess you can fault Rick Barnes for bringing him in the first place, for signing him in the first place. See, he was an odd take to begin with, but you look at his size and the position he plays in today's day and age of college basketball, and how that 6'11" power forward can extend the floor with an ability to shoot the basketball, and that's attractive in today's day and age of college basketball. So you kind of see what he saw there, but Zach Kent is also as slow as molasses and doesn't necessarily play great defense, and just wasn't a great fit for Tennessee. So you do fault Rick Barnes a little bit there, but I don't think Zach Kent leaving the team hurts or impacts this season. I think the loss of Derek Walker and DJ Burns and Grant Williams leaving a year early is more impactful than Zach Kent leaving. So, and then you also look at Jordan Bone leaving a year earlier, and a lot of people want to complain about Barnes not having a backup plan for Jordan Bone leaving to go to the NBA. But I mean, I thought if you go back and you look at his plan at the time, I don't fault him for his thought process of looking at the roster and saying, well, we have fifth-year senior Lamonte Turner, we have five-star freshman Josiah Jordan-James coming in, and we have Jordan Bowden who can handle the ball as well. So I don't think that that's a bad backup plan for Jordan Bone. And it really wasn't even a backup plan because you were already going to have Lamonte and Bowden on the roster, and theoretically you have Bone, so you're just adding Josiah But I don't blame Barnes for thinking that Tennessee's point guard duties will be perfectly fine with Lamonte, Josiah, and Bowden. Like, to me, that's it's going to be hard to find a better backcourt duo to handle the point guard responsibilities in the SEC, in my opinion, if that trio is playing up to their ability. And just Tennessee's run into bad luck as to why they were unable to get production that they expected from that position. I mean, it's just truly bad luck that Lamonte was dealing with the shoulder, that Josiah has been dealing with a hip/groin injury all year long, and then I think it's just bad luck that Jordan Bowden's shot can't fall, because I look at his shots and they go in and out. They rim in and out nearly every single time. And he's barely missing his shot, and it's just pure bad luck on most of them, in my opinion. So, I mean, and you kind of look at the other positions, and Eve Pons has taken a huge step forward this year. John Fulkerson is even better than he was last year. Devontae Gaines is really coming along. Jalen Johnson, although he should be further along at this point in his career, he has gotten better this season. And then with Urosh, I mean, Urosh, I don't know how you fault Barnes for Urosh's poor play. I mean, the man's 7 foot, and he only has 5 defensive rebounds in like 10 games this season, and that's not coaching to me. Obviously, coaching can help, but even with bad coaching, he should have more than 5 defensive rebounds in double-digit games at 7 feet tall. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's just poor basketball, in my opinion. And part of it is the fact that Urosh wasn't able to play early in the season and play through these mistakes and learn through these, troubling times, I guess, like Devontae Gaines was able to, like Josiah was able to do at certain times, like Bowden and Folke and Pons were able to do early in their career. But Urosh just has to be better, quite frankly. So I think a lot of it is bad luck, and I haven't seen Barnes do anything this season that I have really faulted him for, and I don't think that's me being just blind to anything. I truly think that this is just a year in which Tennessee has run into bad luck, and to me, they shouldn't even be in the position that they are right now. They should not be 2 games out of a potential double bye in the SEC tournament with everything that has happened this season, with everything that they've added middle of the year. Santiago Vescovi is a special player for what he has been able to do this season, but I also don't think that he's able to do what he's been able to do this season if it weren't for having a coach like Rick Barnes, who is able to bring him into the fold flawlessly middle of the year as conference play is beginning. So yes, a lot of it is Vescovi just being special, but you also have to give a lot of credit to Tennessee's coaching staff for being able to integrate him so flawlessly. I think they're considering the circumstances, Rick Barnes has maybe done more than what he should have this season. And at the end of the day, this year was always a transition year, even if we didn't want to admit that before the season started. And even in a transition year, Tennessee, with bad luck, still fought for a chance to get to the NCAA tournament. And they're just simply outmanned because it is a transition year. So I personally don't look at Rick Barnes with any funk based off how this season has gone. I think it's just been just bad luck, quite frankly.
I've heard you compare Uroš Plagic to Kyle Alexander, and Barnes both did as well. You look at what Plagic's doing right now in his redshirt freshman season, his first year at Tennessee, and as you mentioned, he's not getting enough rebounds. He's averaging 3.1 points and 1.2 rebounds in 9.1 minutes per game. You look at Kyle Alexander in his freshman season at Tennessee in 12.2 minutes per game, so just over 3 minutes more per game. He averaged less points, 1.7, but he had more rebounds, or more total rebounds at 3.2. So he's kind of the opposite. He's a guy that, this is kind of what you would want Uroš to be. He's a guy you kind of need to be more of a rebounder. They're kind of reversed. Plagic's offensive game is a little bit ahead of where Alexander's was as a freshman, but Alexander was a better defender and better rebounder. I just think right now it's way too early to be throwing in the towel on Plavsic, because you look at what Alexander did as a true freshman, shot 43.2% from the field, 65.6% from the free throw line. Plavsic shooting 38.9% and 54.5% from the free throw line. I just think it's way too early for people to be labeling Plavsic a bust. And that doesn't mean he's going to turn out like Kyle Alexander did and be a very solid contributor both offensively and defensively as a senior. And I don't think Alexander really lived up quite to what people were hoping he could be, but he was an effective player for Tennessee by the time his senior season was around, and he was definitely a difference maker when he was hurt, and Tennessee's second round loss to that NCAA tournament. But to the same point about Barnes, if you're as a fan or media member or whatever, and if you're gonna bash him, and understandably, I think he deserves some blame for missing evaluations. If you're gonna bash him and get on to him, rip him for not being able to develop Jalen Johnson, not being able to develop, I won't say Jordan Bowden. Like I said, this year it's been remarkable how many wide open shots he's missed, how many balls have just not gone in that looks like they should have. He's not been breaking a lot of shots. It's been weird. So if you're gonna fault Barnes for not being able to develop and get the most out of guys like Jalen Johnson, out of Zach Kent, out of Derek Walker, I don't think you can really blame DJ Burns on Barnes. But if you want to, whatever. If you're gonna rip him for all those guys, you also still have to give him credit for Lamonte Turner, Admiral Schofield, Kyle Alexander, for Jordan Bone, for Grant Williams, for John Fulkerson, for Yves Pons. You've got to give him credit, and for what he's been able to do in his first year, in the first 2 months of Vescovi's career at Tennessee. And you see promise from Devontae Gaines, especially on the defensive end. You don't really know what you're getting from James right now because he's been hurt, but I like what I've seen from him defensively, especially when he's been healthy. That Josiah Jordan James is a difference maker on defense. He's not had a strong offensive start. Efficiency-wise, he actually hasn't been that bad. He just doesn't take a whole lot of shots. Defensively, he's been lights out. I think you've mentioned a couple different times, Ben. This season, with Turner being out, James has been Tennessee's best perimeter defender all year for Tennessee, after Turner went down especially. He's been great on defense. It doesn't show up in the stat sheet as much as what offense does, but James has been a very solid defender. And that's why Bowden still plays, because Bowden's been a very solid defender too. Without those two guys on the perimeter for Tennessee defensively this year, they're getting torched a lot more often than what they have been. They haven't been torched very often this year by offenses. You've had a few games, the Georgia game where Anthony Edwards just went off. There's been a couple other games. I think Kentucky had a decent offensive game too. They just couldn't miss a shot, it felt like. There have been a few games where teams have done well offensively against Tennessee, but for the most part, they have, I think, the best scoring defense, or one of the best scoring defenses in the SEC. And that's not by just happenstance or by luck. They've been consistently a good perimeter defense, and I've been very surprised at how good their interior defense has been without them having a post presence like they had last year. Kyle Alexander wasn't a dominating post presence, but he was a good rim protector. Grant Williams and Ira Schofield could defend in the paint. This year, you've had really Fulkerson and Pons be kind of the only guys you have in the interior, down low on the post to defend. And Tennessee's done a really good job of crashing in there and blocking shots and altering shots. They have one of the best 2-point field goal percentage defenses in the SEC and in college basketball. Now, that's also come back to bite them a little bit because they've been out of position to stop offensive rebounds, and that's been killing Tennessee in several games too. But I think, Ben, we're both in agreement here, and I'll be curious if our listeners want to chime in on YouTube or Twitter or whatever. You can find us at Rocky Top Insider on Twitter. At Mr._Rutherford is where I am, and he's at BenMcKee14. If you want to share your thoughts with us about this on Twitter, or just comment on YouTube video as well. But I think it's a lot more on the roster and just the bad luck. And if you're going to rip Barnes for not developing some of these guys, and I think it's fair. I think it's fair to criticize him for not getting more out of Jalen Johnson, for not, for missing his evaluation on Zach Kent, for missing his evaluation on Derek Walker. But you look at his hit percentage. His hit percentage has been a lot higher than I would say a lot of coaches who, especially when he came in here and he wasn't recruiting those 4- and 5-star guys immediately. If you look at the coaches who've had to come in and recruit 3 stars and develop them, I can't think of any off the top of my head. I'd have to maybe ask around and look at other coaches and talk around the SEC and other reporters and things like that too to see. But you'd be hard pressed to find someone who's done a better job of evaluating and developing talent at a 3-star level than what Rick Barnes has been able to do at Tennessee. You're not going to hit on all your evaluations, and for Tennessee, it just kind of happened to be that a couple of the guys that he missed on happened to be affecting this specific year. But I'm with you, Ben, that I think Barnes deserves, I guess, a little blame, but I put this a lot more on the roster and a lot more on. I mean, they were just dealt really bad hands this year specifically. I think we talked about it on a previous podcast that you got very lucky the last 2 years without injuries and big roster changes and things like that. You didn't really have many of those. This year, you've not had a shortage of changes and a shortage of shortcomings for Tennessee, and for, like you said, for them to be where they are right now at 15-11. They've had some bad losses. They've also had some good wins. They came back and beat Alabama. Washington ended up being kind of a bad team, but they did beat VCU. They hung tough with a few other high quality teams like Kentucky and Kansas. I mean, it's somewhat surprising that they're where they are right now. That they're not closer to 500 or have a losing record. I mean, you look at some other games they've won, and you're thinking they could have easily lost that game. I don't know if they make the NCAA tournament. I think it's more likely to make the NIT tournament. But I don't think it's fair to thrust a boatload of blame on Barnes for this one.
No, and I would be stunned if they made the NCAA tournament. At this point, it's going to take them winning out and probably making it to the SEC tournament championship game in order to make the NCAA tournament, which maybe it is doable. I don't trust this team will get it done just because they are inconsistent on offense. They have one of the better defenses in the SEC, but they're just too inconsistent on the offensive end. But like I told Swain the other day on the Swain event, is that when I sit down and I look at the scores around the SEC, and Texas A&M is beating out Alabama, and Georgia, the worst team in the SEC, is beating Auburn, one of the better teams in the SEC, by double digits. I mean, who's to say it couldn't happen? I mean, anything is really possible just because the SEC is so up and down this season. It's really been a surprising outcome every single night. So I don't think Tennessee at all will do it. But who's to say that they couldn't get hot and make a run here? And at the end of the day, Rick Barnes does deserve a little bit of blame because he is the head coach. He is the caretaker of the program. But I think if you look down and you judge him fairly, you realize that a lot of the negative storylines this season have been out of his control. And when you consider that their 3 best players going into the season haven't been what they expected for various reasons, and they added 2 mid-year guys, this team shouldn't even be, in contention for any postseason play. I mean, I think that they have exceeded expectations a smidge based off of everything that has happened this season. So if I were to fault Rick Barnes for anything, it would be for the fact that Jalen Johnson isn't further along as a 4th-year junior. Derek Walker ended up transferring. Zach Kent was a bad take in terms of Tennessee should have never signed him, quite frankly. I don't fault Tennessee for DJ Burns. DJ Burns is at Winthrop because of DJ Burns. So at the end of the day, those are the things that I fault Rick Barnes for. And I'm not going to fault him for the whole Quez Glover not being at Tennessee and the former Bearden standout being at Florida, because at the end of the day, who would you rather have? Josiah Jordan-James, who is a potential NBA pick, or Quez Glover, who is a developmental player. And look, I would have loved to have had Quez Glover. I'm just saying that the decision to not bring in Quez Glover because you have Josiah Jordan-James, and then on top of having Josiah Jordan-James, you're bringing in Jaden Springer and Keon Johnson behind him, it makes sense as to why you would not take Quez Glover. So those are kind of my thoughts on what to blame Barnes for and what not to blame Barnes for. At the end of the day, it's just been a really unfortunate season in a transition year.
Yeah, absolutely. And your point there about the SEC just really not making sense this year and being topsy-turvy. I mean, kind of the whole NCAA season this year has been that way for the most part. You've had like 3 teams who have been consistently pretty good, and everything else has been just weird. You look at the standings right now, Kentucky's kind of sitting there a little comfortably at the top, 2 games ahead of Auburn, LSU, and Florida. But you look at the seeds, or projected seeds between 2 through 8, Auburn, LSU, Florida, Mississippi State, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas A&M. Seeds 2 through 8 right now are separated by 2 games. You have Auburn at 9-4, LSU and Florida at 9-4, Mississippi State and South Carolina are 8-5, Tennessee and Texas A&M are 7-6. And right below that, as the 9th seed, you have Alabama at 6-7, and suddenly Missouri's 5-8 in conference play. And so there's who knows? Tennessee could finish right in the middle. They could slip and fall into closer to that bottom 4 area. They could also rise up and be a top 5 and almost get that top 4 seed and be a team that gets a double bye. I mean, it's just, you don't know, man. It's been a really weird year for the SEC right now. When you have 2 games separating 7 different teams essentially on the standings right now, and you're getting close to the end of the regular season. I mean, there's a lot up for grabs, and Tennessee can do a whole lot to help themselves out. They're hovering around that 500 mark. If they go out here and even they just go 2-3 down the stretch, they're going to finish the season at right exactly 500 in SEC play, and should be in line for kind of around a 7 seed or so, depending on what Texas A&M and Alabama and South Carolina do, and kind of how tiebreakers and stuff like that work. But for them to be where they are right now, it is, I wouldn't say remarkable, but it's somewhat surprising when you consider how much they've gone through and how much attrition they have faced. But I think that'll be where we end this episode of the RTI podcast. Hope you all enjoyed it. For next time, we will probably be doing some more spring football stuff and looking ahead to spring practices. We may actually I've been toying around with this idea of asking for a mailbag edition of just a regular RTI podcast. We do a mailbag on the website at RockyTopInsider.com, which actually will be coming out shortly after this podcast comes out. And we also do a mailbag edition every once in a while of the RTI and VR2 recruiting podcast, but we haven't really done one for the main podcast. So I'm toying with that idea. We may do that one for the next one, just to get your questions about what you're looking forward to, what you want to know heading into spring practices and stuff. So we'll see. And unless something kind of happens between now and the next time Ben and I record, that might be the route we take. But be on the lookout for that. Thank you all for listening to this episode. As I mentioned earlier, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, if you have an Android device, we're on there as well. And RockyTopInsider.com is where you can find all of our content, not just our podcasts, but video stuff and articles and everything as well. We'll have plenty of stuff this weekend for the Auburn-Tennessee game. Ben will also have baseball coverage for the Tennessee baseball team. They have a very important little tournament going on this weekend in Texas. It's going to be a big test. They're facing a couple of different ranked teams this weekend. It's going to be kind of see where Tennessee baseball really is. Are they as good as what they've shown here in the first 4 games, where they haven't played, great competition necessarily, but, how much progress have they made from last year? So it's going to be a big test for Tennessee baseball this weekend. Ben will also have you covered for Lady Vols basketball and stuff as well. Signing off for Ben McKee, I am Nathaniel Rutherford. We appreciate you all tuning in. And until next time, this has been another episode of the RTI Podcast.